Ethan Carter sat quietly at a table in one of London's most exclusive dining establishments, the flicker of candlelight casting soft shadows across his face. The grandeur of the restaurant, its crystal chandeliers, velvet curtains, and hushed elegance, did little to touch the void within him. He gazed through the rain-streaked window, watching droplets race each other down the glass. Outside, the city was drenched in gray, a fitting reflection of the heaviness in his soul. For over 20 years, the ache had been his constant companion. Losing Sophie, his beloved wife, had shattered him in ways he never imagined. Her sudden and tragic death left a chasm no amount of success or ambition could bridge. He'd built a vast business empire, earning accolades and admiration from the world, yet none of it mattered. His triumphs felt hollow, their sparkle dimmed by the shadow of his grief. Each day was a performance, a charade to mask the relentless ache in his chest. Ethan picked up his glass of wine, absent-mindedly swirling the deep red liquid as if searching for answers within its depths. The glitz of high society, the deals, the parties, the acclaim, had long since lost their flavor. A deep sigh escaped his lips as the weight of his loss pressed down on him once more. The years had moved on, but his heart had stayed behind, locked in a moment of profound love and irreversible loss. As he set his glass down, a voice broke through his haze of introspection. "Excuse me, but is this seat taken?" Startled, Ethan looked up to see a young woman with a bright smile and piercing green eyes standing across from him. Her auburn hair was tied back in a simple ponytail, and though her attire was casual compared to the restaurant's usual crowd, she carried herself with an easy confidence that intrigued him. "No, not at all," he replied, gesturing for her to sit. He wasn't in the mood for company, but something about her boldness caught him off guard. "Thanks," she said, sliding into the chair. "You looked like you could use a distraction." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" "Absolutely. I've got a knack for spotting people lost in their own heads." She extended a hand. "I'm Clara Jensen." "Ethan Carter," he said, shaking her hand. Her grip was firm, her presence oddly grounding. Clara leaned forward, her elbows resting on the table. "You're not going to believe this, but I'm actually here for you." "For me?" he asked, skepticism lacing his tone. "You've got my attention." "Well," she said with a sly grin, "not just you. I mean your foundation, the Carter Initiative. My nonprofit was shortlisted for your latest round of grants. I've been trying to get a meeting with someone from your team for weeks." Ethan couldn't help but chuckle softly. "Bold approach. Crashing my dinner to pitch your cause. Works better than emails that get ignored," she quipped. "Besides, you seemed like you could use a break from whatever you were brooding over." Their conversation unfolded with surprising ease. Clara's energy and wit chipped away at Ethan's usual guarded demeanor. She spoke passionately about her organization, which helped rebuild communities affected by natural disasters. Her stories were filled with hope and resilience, a stark contrast to the gloom that had settled over Ethan's world. As she talked, he found himself smiling, a rare, genuine expression that felt foreign after so many years. Her enthusiasm was contagious, and for the first time in ages, Ethan felt a flicker of something he couldn't quite name. Was it curiosity? Hope? He wasn't sure, but it was enough to hold his attention. Then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, Clara stood up. "I'll let you get back to your evening. Thanks for humoring me." "Wait," Ethan said, surprising himself. "Why don't you stay? Order something. I'd like to hear more about your work." She tilted her head, studying him for a moment before nodding. "All right, but only if you promise not to brood." Ethan chuckled. "Deal." As they shared a meal, the storm outside intensified, the rain pounding against the window. Yet inside, the atmosphere shifted. Clara's stories painted vivid pictures of lives changed, of communities finding strength in the face of devastation. Ethan couldn't help but draw parallels to his own journey, how he had poured himself into building something meaningful after losing Sophie. But there was something more, something unspoken in the way Clara looked at him. A question lingered in her eyes, though she never voiced it. And for the first time in decades, Ethan felt a strange sense of possibility. Perhaps this meeting wasn't as coincidental as it seemed. As the evening wound down, Clara reached into her bag and pulled out a small envelope. "Before I go," she said, sliding it across the table, "I want you to read this. It's something I wrote about your foundation's impact on a village we worked with. I think you'll find it interesting." Ethan took the envelope, his fingers brushing against the crisp paper. "Thank you. I'll read it tonight." "Good," she said, her smile returning. "I hope it reminds you why you started all of this in the first place." With that, she left, leaving Ethan alone once more. But this time, the void within him didn't feel quite as overwhelming. He glanced at the envelope, a sense of anticipation stirring within him. Little did he know, opening it would set off a chain of events that would change his life in ways he could never have imagined. Ethan returned home to his sprawling London penthouse later that evening, the envelope still clutched in his hand. The rain had followed him, drumming against the floor-to-ceiling windows of his living room. The room was immaculate, designed to impress rather than comfort. But tonight, it felt strangely warm. Clara's visit had stirred something in him. He settled into his leather armchair, poured himself another glass of wine, and opened the envelope. Inside was a letter and a small photograph. The picture showed a group of people standing in front of a row of newly constructed houses. Children grinned at the camera, their arms around each other, while adults beamed with a mix of pride and relief. Ethan unfolded the letter, his curiosity growing. "Dear Mr. Carter, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I hope you do. My name is Clara Jensen, and I've dedicated my life to disaster recovery. A few years ago, a grant from the Carter Initiative allowed my team to rebuild a village in Nepal after a devastating earthquake. At first, I thought it would be like any other project, helpful, yes, but not transformative. I was wrong. This grant didn't just rebuild homes. It rebuilt lives. People found hope where there was none. There's one story I want to share with you. A young boy named Kieran lost everything in the quake. His family, his home, his future. But thanks to your foundation, we were able to create a space for him to thrive. Today, he's studying engineering at a university in Kathmandu. He told me, if someone who doesn't know me believes in my future, then I must believe in it too. I think you should know that you've been building more than an empire, you've been building bridges, ones you might not even see. If nothing else, I hope this letter reminds you of the lives you've touched, the good you've done. And maybe, just maybe, it'll help you rediscover the purpose behind it all. With gratitude, Clara Jensen." Ethan stared at the letter for a long time, the words blurring as his mind drifted. It had been so long since he'd thought about the true purpose of his foundation. He'd started it in Sophie's memory, hoping to channel his grief into something meaningful. But over the years, it had become just another line item in his portfolio, managed by a team of experts while he kept his distance. The photograph on his lap drew his attention again. The children's smiles were infectious, their joy palpable even in the still image. He felt a pang of guilt for how disconnected he'd become from his own mission. And then, as he flipped the letter over, something else fell out. A tiny locket. Confused, Ethan picked it up. It was old, its gold surface scratched and worn. But when he opened it, he found a faded photograph inside. His breath caught in his throat. It was Sophie. The room seemed to tilt, the air sucked out of it. Ethan's pulse quickened as he stared at the tiny picture. It was a photograph he didn't remember being taken, yet there was no mistaking it. Sophie was laughing, her hair tousled by the wind, her eyes shining with the joy he'd loved so deeply. How could Clara have this? The wineglass slipped from his hand, shattering on the floor. He didn't care. His mind raced with questions, each more bewildering than the last. Was this some kind of cruel joke? A coincidence? Or something else entirely? Before he could think it through, his phone buzzed on the table, breaking the silence. The screen lit up with an unknown number. Hesitant, he answered. "Mr. Carter," a voice said, low and deliberate. "I see you found the locket." Ethan froze. "Who is this?" That's not important right now. What matters is that you listen carefully. Everything you think you know about Sophie's death, it's not the whole story. Ethan's stomach churned. What are you talking about? Who are you? All your questions will be answered, but first you need to meet me. Tomorrow, noon, the Garden Court Hotel. Come alone. The line went dead. For a moment, Ethan sat in stunned silence, the phone still pressed to his ear. His heart pounded as the implications of the call sank in. Could it be true? Was there something about Sophie's death that he didn't know? He had been told it was an accident, a sudden, tragic car crash. But now, doubts he hadn't dared to entertain began to creep in. Why hadn't he asked more questions at the time? Why had he been so willing to accept the explanation? Ethan rose from his chair, pacing the room as his thoughts spiraled. The locket, the call, Clara's letter, were they connected? And if so, how? His mind reeled, but one thing was clear. He needed answers. As the rain continued to pound against the windows, Ethan resolved to go to the meeting. Whatever lay ahead, he would face it. For the first time in years, the ache in his chest was joined by something else. A spark of determination. Little did he know, this decision would lead him into a web of secrets and revelations that would upend everything he thought he knew about his life and Sophie's. The next morning, Ethan barely slept. The storm outside had subsided, but inside, his mind churned relentlessly. The locket sat on his desk, its presence both comforting and unnerving. He found himself opening it again and again, staring at Sophie's picture, searching for a connection between the past and the cryptic phone call. By noon, Ethan was seated in the lobby of the Garden Court Hotel, a place he had passed countless times but never entered. Its opulent interior mirrored the exclusivity he was used to, but today it felt alien, hostile, even. He scanned the room, every nerve on edge. A man in a charcoal gray suit approached. His face was angular, his expression unreadable, and his dark eyes fixed intently on Ethan. "Mr. Carter," he said in a low voice. "Come with me." "Who are you?" Ethan demanded, keeping his voice steady. The man ignored the question and gestured toward a private meeting room. "This way." Ethan hesitated for a fraction of a second before following. Whatever awaited him, he needed answers. Inside the room, the blinds were drawn, and a single lamp cast a dim glow over a wooden table. The man gestured for Ethan to sit, then placed a plain manila envelope on the table between them. "Let's get straight to it," the man said, his voice clipped. "What I'm about to show you may be difficult to accept, but it's the truth." Ethan's gaze flicked to the envelope. "Why should I trust you? You don't have to. But you came here because you want to know what really happened to Sophie. This," he said, tapping the envelope, "is where it begins." Ethan clenched his fists under the table, his pulse hammering in his ears. "Show me." The man slid the envelope toward him. Ethan opened it with trembling hands, pulling out a set of photographs. As he flipped through them, his breath caught in his throat. The images were grainy but unmistakable. Sophie, alive and smiling, walking through a bustling market. The photos were dated 2 years after her supposed death. This can't be real," Ethan stammered, his voice barely audible. "It's real," the man said. "The accident wasn't what you were told. Sophie didn't die that day. She disappeared." Ethan's world tilted. He gripped the edge of the table, his mind racing. "Disappeared? Why? Where is she?" The man leaned forward, his tone growing even more serious. "That's the part one don't have answers to yet. What I do know is that Sophie's life was in danger, and someone went to great lengths to erase her from yours. You've been living in the shadow of a lie." Ethan felt as though the air had been knocked out of him. For 20 years, he had mourned her, blamed himself, and built his life around the void she left behind. And now, to learn that she might still be alive, it was too much to process. "Who would do this?" he demanded. "And why are you telling me now?" The man's expression darkened. "Let's just say I have a vested interest in finding the truth. Sophie's disappearance is connected to something much bigger. And if we're going to uncover it, we need to work together. Why should I trust you?" Ethan shot back, his anger finally breaking through the shock. For all I know, you're feeding me another lie. The man nodded, as if expecting the reaction. Fair point, but ask yourself this. Why would I go to the trouble of finding you, showing you those photos, if I didn't believe you were key to uncovering the truth? Ethan stared at the photographs again, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. He wanted to walk away, to retreat back into the numbness he'd grown accustomed to. But the image of Sophie, alive, vibrant, drew him back. What do you need from me? He asked finally. The man reached into his pocket and pulled out a small USB drive. There's a name on here. Someone who was close to Sophie in the months leading up to her disappearance. Find them, talk to them, and be careful. Whoever did this went to great lengths to bury the truth. They won't take kindly to you digging it up. As Ethan left the hotel, the weight of the USB drive in his pocket felt like a burning coal. His mind raced with questions, doubts, and a flicker of hope he hadn't felt in decades. If Sophie was alive, he had to find her. But the thought terrified him. What if she had left by choice? What if the answers he sought only brought more pain? His phone buzzed, jolting him from his thoughts. It was a text from an unknown number. Be careful who you trust. Not everyone wants you to find her. Ethan froze, the warning sending a chill down his spine. Was this from the man he had just met, or someone else entirely? As he climbed into his car, he resolved to see this through no matter the cost. For 20 years, he had lived with the ache of losing Sophie. Now he would stop at nothing to uncover the truth, even if it shattered everything he thought he knew. Little did he realize, the search for Sophie would lead him down a path fraught with danger, betrayal, and revelations that would test the limits of his strength and resolve. Back in his penthouse, Ethan sat at his desk, the USB drive in front of him like a loaded weapon. The city lights glittered beyond the window, a stark contrast to the storm raging within him. His fingers hesitated over his laptop's keyboard. Did he really want to dive into this? He exhaled deeply and plugged the drive into the computer. A single file appeared on the screen, contact.txt. He clicked it open, and one name stood out among the sparse lines of text. Dr. Ava Grayson. Beneath the name was a short note. Private clinic, Stratford Road. Connection to Sophie. Last seen 6 months before the accident. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his thoughts racing. The name didn't ring a bell, but if this Dr. Grayson had been close to Sophie before her disappearance, she might hold the key to understanding what really happened. The next morning, Ethan set out for Stratford Road. The clinic, a modest but well-kept building, was nestled among a row of boutique shops. It felt unassuming, almost too ordinary for the gravity of his purpose. He stepped inside, his heart pounding. The receptionist, a kind-faced woman in her early 30s, greeted him. Do you have an appointment? No, Ethan replied, clearing his throat. But I was hoping to speak with Dr. Grayson. It's urgent. She frowned slightly. Dr. Grayson isn't in today. She only sees patients by appointment. Please, Ethan said, his voice tinged with desperation. It's about Sophie Carter. The receptionist's expression shifted, confusion, then recognition, and finally something else. Was it fear? She glanced over her shoulder, then leaned in closer. I'm sorry, but I can't help you, she whispered, her voice trembling. You need to leave. Ethan's heart sank. Wait, please. If you know something, go, she said, her tone firm now. It's not safe. Before he could press further, the receptionist's phone rang, and she picked it up, turning away. Ethan stood there for a moment, unsure of his next move. Then, as he turned to leave, a hand brushed his arm. He looked down to see a young nurse, her dark eyes wide with urgency. Meet me around the corner, she murmured before hurrying off. 15 minutes later, Ethan stood in a quiet alley behind the clinic. The nurse appeared, her coat pulled tight against the chilly wind. She glanced around nervously before speaking. Dr. Grayson hasn't been herself since Sophie disappeared, the nurse said in a low voice. She doesn't talk about it, but I've seen her looking at old files late at night, like she's haunted by something. What kind of files? Ethan asked. The nurse hesitated. I don't know exactly, but they're connected to a program she worked on before opening this clinic. Something called Project Ithaca. Ethan's brow furrowed. Project Ithaca? What is that? The nurse shook her head. I don't know, but whatever it is, it's not good. I overheard her arguing with someone about it last month. She said, if they find out what I know, I'm as good as dead. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. Who was she talking to? A man. Tall, sharp suit, slicked back hair. I didn't catch his name, but he looked dangerous. I stayed out of sight. Ethan pressed a hand to his forehead, his mind racing. Project Ithaca. Sophie. A mysterious man threatening a doctor who might hold the answers he needed. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to form a picture, but it was one that only deepened the mystery. Do you know how I can find Dr. Grayson? He asked. The nurse hesitated again, then scribbled an address on a scrap of paper. She has a private office outside the city, but be careful. If she doesn't trust you, she won't tell you anything. Ethan took the paper, his resolve hardening. Thank you. The nurse nodded, her expression tense. Just watch your back. There are people who don't want the truth to come out. Later that evening, Ethan found himself driving down a winding country road, the address leading him to a secluded house surrounded by trees. The air was thick with tension as he parked and approached the door. He knocked firmly, the sound echoing in the stillness. After a long pause, the door opened a crack, revealing a cautious pair of eyes. Who are you? The woman demanded. Dr. Grayson? Ethan asked. My name is Ethan Carter. I need to talk to you about Sophie. The door opened wider, revealing a woman in her late 40s, her face lined with worry. You shouldn't be here, she said, her voice trembling. It's too dangerous. Please, Ethan said, his tone urgent. I've spent 20 years mourning my wife, and now I'm being told she might still be alive. I need answers. Dr. Grayson hesitated, her gaze searching his face. Finally, she stepped aside. Come in. But you're not going to like what I have to tell you. Inside, the house was sparsely furnished, the walls lined with bookshelves overflowing with medical journals and documents. Dr. Grayson motioned for Ethan to sit, then poured herself a glass of whiskey. What I'm about to tell you stays between us, she began. If anyone finds out I spoke to you, I'll be putting both our lives at risk. Ethan nodded, his pulse quickening. I understand. Dr. Grayson sat across from him, clutching her glass. Sophie came to me 6 months before the accident, desperate and terrified. She said she'd uncovered something. A secret so dangerous that her life was in jeopardy. What kind of secret? Ethan asked. Dr. Grayson hesitated. She didn't tell me everything, but it had something to do with Project Ithaca, a classified program linked to a powerful organization. She was trying to expose them, but she was being followed. She came to me for help, and her voice broke, and she looked away. I didn't do enough. When I heard about the accident, I knew it wasn't an accident at all. Ethan's hands tightened into fists. Then what was it? Dr. Grayson met his gaze, her eyes filled with regret. It was a cover-up. They made her disappear to protect their secrets. And if you're digging into this, you're painting a target on your back. Ethan's stomach churned. Sophie had been trying to protect him, even as her life unraveled. And now, 20 years later, he was about to uncover the truth she had died to expose, or worse, the truth she had lived to hide. I don't care about the risks, he said firmly. I need to know where she is. Dr. Grayson sighed deeply, then slid a folder across the table. This is all I have. It might lead you to her or to the people who made her disappear. But once you open this door, there's no going back. Ethan stared at the folder, his resolve hardening. He had come too far to turn back now. With trembling hands, he opened it, ready to face whatever lay ahead. Ethan opened the folder, his heart pounding as he sifted through its contents. It was a jumbled mix of documents. Handwritten notes, blurry photographs, and a single, haunting letter. Each piece seemed disconnected at first glance, but a few key phrases caught his attention: Project Ithaca, synthetic identities, and Operation Obsidian. "What is all this?" he asked, his voice edged with frustration. Dr. Grayson leaned back in her chair, her hands trembling slightly as she poured another glass of whiskey. "It's everything I managed to gather after Sophie disappeared. These papers are fragments of a much larger puzzle, one I've spent years trying to piece together." Ethan's eyes fell on the letter. It was addressed to Sophie and dated 2 weeks before the accident. The handwriting was familiar, its slanted, looping script unmistakable. "Sophie, I hope this reaches you before it's too late. You've always been braver than I could ever be, but you need to understand the stakes. Project Ithaca isn't just some corporate conspiracy. It's a global operation with unimaginable power behind it. They're not just after you. They're after anyone who threatens to expose them. I found a safe place for us, but you'll need to trust me and disappear completely. If you stay, they'll come for you, and for Ethan. Burn this after you read it. Trust no one, not even those you think are helping you. I'll find a way to contact you when it's safe. Yours always, L." Ethan's breath hitched. "Who's L?" Dr. Grayson shook her head. "I don't know, but whoever they were, they cared deeply for Sophie. It's possible they're the reason she's still alive, if she is." Ethan felt a swell of emotions: confusion, anger, and a flicker of hope. He glanced at the blurry photographs in the folder. They showed shadowy figures entering and exiting unmarked buildings, all time-stamped around the time of Sophie's disappearance. One photo stood out, a grainy image of Sophie standing next to a man. His face was partially obscured, but something about his posture seemed familiar. "Do you know who this is?" Ethan asked, holding up the photo. Dr. Grayson hesitated. "I don't have a name, but I've seen him before. He's connected to Project Ithaca, someone high up in the organization. If Sophie was with him, she might have been trying to negotiate her safety." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Where do I start? How do I find these people?" Dr. Grayson pulled out a business card from a hidden pocket in her coat. It was simple, black, and unmarked except for a phone number embossed in silver. "This belonged to a man who approached me after Sophie disappeared. He wanted to know what I knew, how much Sophie had told me. I never called the number, but it might lead you closer to the truth." Ethan took the card, his fingers brushing over the smooth surface. "Do you think this person is connected to Sophie?" Dr. Grayson gave him a grim look. "If they are, it won't be in a way you'll like." That night, back in his penthouse, Ethan sat at his desk, staring at the black card. His thoughts churned with everything he'd learned. Sophie's fear, her desperation, her warnings. It all painted a picture of a woman caught in a web of danger, fighting to protect herself and the man she loved. But why hadn't she told him? Why had she carried the burden alone? Ethan's hand hovered over his phone. Calling the number felt like stepping into the abyss, but the thought of doing nothing was unbearable. With a deep breath, he dialed. The line clicked, and a calm, authoritative voice answered. "This is Colton." Ethan's mouth went dry. "I need to talk to you about Sophie Carter." There was a long pause. When the voice spoke again, it was colder. "You've made a mistake calling this number. Forget it, and forget Sophie." "I can't do that," Ethan said firmly. "I know she's alive, and I know you're connected to what happened." Another pause, then a low chuckle. "You're either brave or stupid, Mr. Carter. Meet me tomorrow at the Regent's Wharf warehouse. Midnight. Come alone." The line went dead. The next day, Ethan spent hours preparing himself for the meeting. He didn't know what to expect, but he knew he couldn't go in unprepared. He packed a few essentials: his phone, a flashlight, and a small recording device, and set out under the cover of darkness. Regent's Wharf was eerily quiet when he arrived, its looming warehouses casting long shadows under the moonlight. He approached the designated building, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. The door creaked as he pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of damp wood and rusting metal. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling, flickering weakly. "Mr. Carter," a voice called from the shadows. Ethan turned to see a man step forward. He was tall and impeccably dressed, his sharp features illuminated by the dim light. His eyes were calculating, his demeanor exuding a quiet menace. "Colton, I presume," Ethan said, keeping his voice steady. The man smiled faintly. "You've gone digging where you shouldn't. That's dangerous." "I'm here for answers," Ethan said. "Where is Sophie?" Colton's smile faded. "The question isn't where she is. It's whether you're ready for what finding her will cost." "What does that mean?" Ethan demanded. Colton stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "If you want to know the truth, you'll need to make sacrifices. You'll need to question everything you thought you knew. Are you prepared for that?" Ethan's resolve hardened. "I'll do whatever it takes." Colton studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Then you're ready for the next step. But be warned. Once you start down this path, there's no turning back." With that, he handed Ethan a sealed envelope. "Inside is a location. Go there, and you'll find someone who can give you the answers you seek. But tread carefully, Mr. Carter. The closer you get to the truth, the more dangerous it becomes." Ethan took the envelope, his pulse quickening. As Colton disappeared into the shadows, he opened it, the faintest glimmer of hope flickering in his chest. The note inside was cryptic but clear. "Ravenswood Asylum, Room 214, midnight." As Ethan left the warehouse, the enormity of what lay ahead began to sink in. The pieces were coming together, but the picture they formed was darker than he could have imagined. He was on the cusp of uncovering a truth that could change everything, and he had no idea if he was ready for what it would reveal. The drive to Ravenswood Asylum was unnervingly quiet. Ethan's GPS guided him deeper into the countryside, the roads narrowing and twisting through dense woods. By the time he arrived, the asylum loomed before him like a forgotten relic of another era. Its Gothic architecture, shrouded in mist, was both foreboding and alluring. The building had long since been decommissioned, but faint lights flickered in the windows, suggesting life, or something close to it. Ethan parked his car and hesitated for a moment, gripping the wheel as his heart pounded. The envelope's instructions echoed in his mind. Room 214. Midnight. This wasn't a place for second guesses. Steeling himself, he stepped out and walked toward the entrance. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of mildew and decay. The faint hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, punctuated by the occasional drip of water echoing through the empty halls. Ethan's footsteps were muffled by the dust-covered carpet, and his every move felt amplified in the oppressive silence. He climbed the grand staircase, its wooden steps groaning under his weight, and made his way to the second floor. The corridors were lined with numbered doors, most of them ajar, revealing rooms stripped bare. Room 214 was at the far end of the hallway, its door shut tightly. Ethan hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob. Was this the moment everything changed? He swallowed hard and turned the knob, pushing the door open. The room was dimly lit, a single desk lamp casting an eerie glow over a cluttered desk. Papers, maps, and photographs were strewn across every surface, creating a chaotic tapestry of information. A figure sat hunched over the desk, their back to the door. "Mr. Carter," the figure said without turning around. Their voice was calm but tinged with weariness. "I've been expecting you." Ethan stepped inside, his pulse quickening. "Who are you?" The figure turned slowly, revealing a man in his 60s, his face weathered but sharp. His piercing blue eyes locked onto Ethan's, and for a moment, neither spoke. "My name is Vincent," the man said. "I worked with Sophie before she disappeared." Ethan's chest tightened. "Where is she? Is she alive?" Vincent gestured for Ethan to sit. "She's alive, but she's not safe. And neither are you." Ethan ignored the chair. "Then tell me where she is." "First, you need to understand what you're walking into," Vincent said. He reached for a file on the desk and handed it to Ethan. Inside were more documents stamped with the name Project Ithaca. As Ethan skimmed the pages, Vincent explained. Project Ithaca was a covert initiative backed by a powerful conglomerate, a shadow organization with ties to governments, corporations, and militaries across the globe. Officially, it was a research program. Unofficially, it was a front for something far darker: identity erasure and synthetic personas. What does that mean? Ethan asked, his voice tight. They developed technology to create new identities for people, perfectly crafted backstories, biometrics, even memories. But the cost was steep. Anyone deemed a threat to the organization was either erased or reprogrammed. Sophie stumbled upon their work while investigating corporate corruption. She became a target. Ethan's hands trembled as he held the file. So they made her disappear? Vincent nodded grimly. She found evidence that could bring them down. They couldn't risk her exposing them, so they staged the accident. But Sophie was smart. She knew they were coming for her. She had an escape plan. Ethan's mind reeled. If she escaped, why hasn't she contacted me? Vincent's expression softened. Because she thought it was the only way to protect you. If they knew you were looking for her, you'd become a target too. Ethan slammed the file onto the desk. I don't care about the risks. I've already lost 20 years of my life to this. Tell me where she is. Vincent sighed and pulled out a map, circling a location deep in Eastern Europe. This is where she was last seen. It's a safe house run by a small resistance network. People who have been fighting back against Ithaca's influence. Ethan grabbed the map, his resolve solidifying. I'm going. Vincent's hand shot out, gripping Ethan's arm. Listen to me. If you go down this path, you'll be hunted. These people don't play by the rules, and they don't leave loose ends. Are you sure you're ready for that? Ethan met Vincent's gaze, his voice steady. I've already lost her once. I'm not losing her again. Vincent released his grip and nodded solemnly. Then you'll need this. He handed Ethan a small black case. Inside was a burner phone, a GPS device, and a single key. What's the key for? Ethan asked. Something Sophie left behind for you, Vincent said cryptically. You'll find it at the safe house. But be careful, this won't be a simple reunion. She's not the same person you remember. Ethan frowned. What does that mean? Vincent hesitated, then said, You'll see. The drive back to London was a blur. Ethan's mind was consumed by Vincent's words, the map burning a hole in his pocket. Sophie was alive. The woman he had grieved for, the love he had thought lost forever, was somewhere out there, waiting to be found. But the idea that she had changed, that the Sophie he knew might no longer exist, gnawed at him. What had she endured in 20 years? What had it done to her? As he parked outside his penthouse, Ethan's phone buzzed. It was another unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. Mr. Carter, a familiar voice said. It was Colton. You're getting closer, aren't you? What do you want? Ethan demanded. Just to warn you, Colton said, his tone almost amused. Not everyone you meet on this journey will want the same thing as you. Be careful who you trust. The line went dead. Ethan stared at the phone, his grip tightening. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, but the picture they formed was darker than he had imagined. And as much as he wanted to believe he was prepared, he couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest part was yet to come. Ethan's flight to Eastern Europe was uneventful, but his mind was anything but calm. Vincent's cryptic warnings played on repeat as he stared out of the window, watching the snow-covered mountains roll by. His destination, a remote village nestled in the foothills of the Carpathians, was as isolated as it was obscure. Whatever Sophie had been hiding from, this place was far enough from prying eyes to keep her safe, or so he hoped. The drive from the airport took hours, the narrow roads winding through thick forests and steep cliffs. By the time Ethan reached the village, night had fallen. The safe house was a nondescript cabin on the edge of the settlement, its exterior weathered and unassuming. As he approached the door, a figure emerged from the shadows, startling him. It was a young man, no older than 25, with a rugged face and sharp, watchful eyes. Mr. Carter? The man asked in a low voice. Ethan nodded. That's me. The man gestured for him to follow. Come quickly. It's not safe to stay outside. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was tense. The room was sparsely furnished, with only a few chairs, a table, and a wood-burning stove that provided the sole source of warmth. Maps and documents were pinned to the walls, their markings indicating a network of locations and routes. A single woman stood by the stove, her arms crossed. "Ethan Carter," she said, her voice tinged with disbelief. "You're braver than I expected, or more foolish." Ethan stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "Who are you?" "I'm Anna," she replied. "I run this safe house. Vincent told me you were coming." "Then you know why I'm here," Ethan said. "Where's Sophie?" Anna hesitated, glancing at the young man. "Sophie's not here, but she left something for you." She reached into a drawer and pulled out a small wooden box, placing it on the table. Ethan opened the box cautiously. Inside was a letter in Sophie's handwriting, along with a locket similar to the one Clara had given him. His breath caught as he unfolded the letter. "Ethan, if you're reading this, it means you've found me, or at least you've come close. I'm sorry for everything I've put you through, for leaving you, for the lies, for the pain. I had no choice. When I discovered the truth about Project Ithaca, I knew I couldn't protect you and expose them at the same time. They would have destroyed you just to get to me. So I did the only thing I could. I disappeared. I've spent the last 20 years trying to bring them down from the shadows. But it's a fight I'm not sure I can win. If you're here, it means you've found the clues I left behind. I don't know if you'll forgive me, but I need you to understand that I did this because I love you. There's one last place to look. A place where the truth about Ithaca is buried. If you're willing to take the risk, go to the coordinates I've included. But be careful. This isn't just about me anymore. It's bigger than either of us. Yours always, Sophie." Ethan's hands trembled as he folded the letter. "Where do the coordinates lead?" Anna hesitated. "To an abandoned research facility deep in the forest. It's been off the grid for years. But if Sophie says the truth is there, she's probably right." The young man, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "It's dangerous. That place is crawling with mercenaries, hired by Ithaca to protect whatever secrets are inside. If you go, you'll need help." Ethan looked at Anna, his jaw set. "Will you help me?" Anna exchanged a glance with the young man before nodding. "We'll get you there. But once we do, you're on your own." The next morning, Anna and the young man, whose name was Luca, led Ethan through the dense forest. Snow blanketed the ground, muffling their footsteps as they moved silently through the trees. The journey took hours, the cold biting at their faces, but the group pressed on, driven by purpose. By midday, they reached the edge of a clearing. In the distance, a cluster of low, concrete buildings stood, their windows shattered and walls covered in graffiti. Guard towers loomed over the perimeter, and men in dark uniforms patrolled with rifles slung over their shoulders. "That's it," Anna whispered. "The facility." Ethan peered through the binoculars Luca handed him. The guards moved in a practiced rhythm, their vigilance evident. "How am I supposed to get in there?" Luca pointed to a drainage tunnel partially hidden by a collapsed section of the fence. "That's your best shot. It'll take you underneath the facility. Once you're inside, look for the main control room. That's where they keep the records." Ethan nodded, his heart pounding. "And if I get caught?" Anna's expression was grim. "Then you better hope you can talk your way out." Ethan made his way toward the tunnel under the cover of darkness. The adrenaline coursing through his veins kept him moving, even as doubt gnawed at the edges of his resolve. This wasn't just about finding Sophie anymore. It was about uncovering the truth she had fought so hard to protect. Inside the tunnel, the air was damp and cold, the faint sound of dripping water echoing around him. He moved cautiously, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. After what felt like an eternity, he reached a ladder that led up to a grate. Pushing it open, he emerged into a dimly lit storage room. Voices drifted down the hall, and Ethan froze, his breath shallow. He pressed himself against the wall, waiting until the sound faded before creeping toward the door. His hands shook as he peeked around the corner, scanning for movement. The facility was eerily quiet, its corridors lined with old equipment and peeling paint. Following Luca's directions, Ethan made his way to the control room. When he finally found it, his heart sank. The door was locked, and the sound of approaching footsteps was growing louder. Ethan's heart raced as the footsteps grew louder, echoing ominously through the dim corridor. He flattened himself against the wall beside the locked door, gripping the small multi-tool Luca had given him. The makeshift weapon was hardly reassuring, but it was all he had. His breaths were shallow, his mind racing through the limited options. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. Ethan held his breath, praying the guard would move on. A flashlight beam swept across the floor, briefly illuminating the narrow sliver of hallway visible from his vantage point. Then, as suddenly as they had come, the footsteps receded. Ethan exhaled slowly, his pulse still hammering. He turned his attention to the door. The lock was old and corroded, a mechanical relic rather than a high-tech security measure. Luca had insisted he'd be able to handle it. Now was the moment to find out. He knelt in front of the lock, working quickly with the multi-tool. His hands trembled, the echoes of his earlier adrenaline spike making precise movements difficult. After what felt like an eternity, the mechanism clicked, and the door creaked open. Ethan slipped inside, closing the door softly behind him. The room was smaller than he'd expected, cluttered with filing cabinets, old computers, and scattered papers. A faint hum filled the air, emanating from a single terminal glowing faintly in the corner. He approached the terminal cautiously, wiping a layer of dust from the screen. The interface was dated but functional, its menus navigable with a keyboard that felt oddly out of place in the high-tech conspiracy he'd stumbled into. After a moment of fumbling, he found a folder labeled Ithaca Archives, redacted. "This has to be it," Ethan muttered under his breath. He inserted the USB drive Vincent had given him and began downloading the files. The progress bar crawled forward, each second feeling like an eternity. Just as the download neared completion, a loud clang echoed from somewhere down the hall. Ethan froze, his eyes darting to the door. The sound grew louder, voices, hurried footsteps. They knew he was here. The download finished with a soft chime. Ethan yanked the USB drive from the terminal, stuffing it into his pocket. He scanned the room for an exit, his eyes landing on a vent grate near the floor. Without hesitation, he pried it open and crawled inside, pulling the cover back into place just as the door burst open. "Search the room," a gruff voice commanded. Ethan lay still in the narrow vent, barely daring to breathe. Through the slats, he could see the boots of two guards as they rifled through the room. Papers rustled, drawers slammed, and curses filled the air as they failed to find what they were looking for. "Nothing," one of them growled. "He's got to be in the building." "Then find him," the other barked. "Now." The boots stomped out of the room, the door slamming shut behind them. Ethan waited, counting the seconds, until the sound of their footsteps faded. Then he began crawling through the vent, his hands and knees scraping against the cold metal. The vent led him to another section of the building, where he emerged into a dark, empty storage room. His body ached from the tight crawl, but he forced himself to keep moving. He needed to get out before the guards regrouped. As he navigated the labyrinthine corridors, he replayed Vincent's words in his mind. "The closer you get, the more dangerous it becomes." The files on the USB drive were clearly valuable, but they weren't the full story. He still didn't know where Sophie was, or what she had uncovered that was so explosive. Ethan finally reached the drainage tunnel Luca had pointed out. Crawling back through the damp, narrow passage, he emerged into the forest, the cold air hitting him like a slap. Anna and Luca were waiting near the tree line, their faces tense. "Did you get it?" Anna asked. Ethan nodded, holding up the USB drive. "I got it, but they're on to me. We need to move." The group hurried back through the forest, the sounds of distant shouting and barking dogs spurring them on. By the time they reached the cabin, Ethan's lungs burned, and his legs felt like lead. Inside, Anna slammed the door behind them and locked it. Luca grabbed a laptop and inserted the USB drive, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he decrypted the files. "What are we looking at?" Ethan asked, leaning over Luca's shoulder. Luca's eyes widened as the first document loaded. "It's everything. Names, locations, operations. Ithaca's entire playbook." Anna joined them, her expression grim as she read over Luca's shoulder. "This isn't just about identity erasure. They've been infiltrating governments, corporations, even humanitarian organizations. They've created an entire shadow network." Ethan's stomach churned. "And Sophie was trying to expose this?" Anna nodded. "But there's more. Look at this." She pointed to a section of the document marked Subjects. Phase X, 7. Ethan's blood ran cold as he read the list of names. His own was among them, along with Sophie's. "What does this mean?" he demanded. "It means they've been watching you," Luca said. "Both of you." Sophie's disappearance wasn't just about silencing her. It was part of a larger plan. Ethan's mind reeled. The files were damning, but they raised more questions than answers. "Is there anything about where Sophie is now?" Luca scrolled further, stopping at a map labeled Active Operations. A single location was highlighted, deep in the heart of a sprawling industrial complex. "This might be it," Luca said. "It's listed as a containment site. If she's alive, she could be there." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Then that's where I'm going." Anna grabbed his arm. "You don't understand. If she's there, it's because they want her to be. This could be a trap." "I don't care," Ethan said, his voice hard. "I've come too far to turn back now." Anna sighed, her expression resigned. "Then we'll help you. But if we're going to do this, we need a plan, and we need to move fast." As the group began preparing for the next stage of their mission, Ethan felt the weight of what lay ahead. The truth was within reach, but so were the dangers Vincent had warned him about. Whatever happened next, there was no turning back. The industrial complex stood on the edge of a desolate landscape, a fortress of steel and concrete surrounded by high fences and patrolled by armed guards. From their vantage point atop a nearby ridge, Ethan, Anna, and Luca surveyed the area under the cover of night. The lights from the complex cast long shadows across the barren terrain, creating an eerie sense of foreboding. "This place is a fortress," Luca muttered, lowering his binoculars. "We're going to need a miracle to get in there." "We don't need a miracle," Anna said, her voice steady. "We need precision. Their patrols follow a set pattern. If we time it right, we can slip through the east gate and use the maintenance tunnels to get inside." Ethan stared at the complex, his jaw clenched. "And if Sophie's not there?" Anna placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then we'll find another lead. But right now, this is our best shot." The plan was simple, but its execution required flawless timing. The group waited until the patrols shifted, then descended from the ridge under the cover of darkness. The biting wind carried the scent of oil and smoke, and the hum of generators grew louder as they approached the fence. Luca worked quickly to disable the gate's electronic lock, his tools glinting faintly in the moonlight. Within moments, the lock clicked open, and the group slipped through, their breaths fogging in the cold air. The maintenance tunnel entrance was exactly where Luca had said it would be, a rusted hatch partially obscured by overgrown weeds. Anna and Ethan helped lift the heavy cover, and one by one, they descended into the darkness below. The tunnel was narrow and damp, its walls slick with condensation. The air smelled of rust and mildew, and the only light came from the faint beams of their flashlights. The group moved in silence, their footsteps muffled by the layers of grime coating the floor. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a junction. Luca consulted the map on his tablet, his face illuminated by its faint glow. "This way," he whispered, pointing to a corridor that sloped upward. "It should take us to the central wing." As they continued, the sound of distant machinery grew louder, accompanied by muffled voices. Ethan's pulse quickened. They were getting closer. Finally, They emerged into a storage area filled with crates and equipment. Anna motioned for the group to take cover behind a stack of boxes as a pair of guards passed by, their conversation indistinct but tense. When the coast was clear, they pressed on, following Luca's map to a secured wing of the complex. A reinforced door blocked their path, its keypad glowing faintly in the dim light. "Can you get us in?" Ethan asked. Luca nodded, his fingers flying across the keypad. "Just give me a minute." As Luca worked, Ethan's thoughts raced. If Sophie was inside, what state would she be in? Would she even recognize him? The doubts gnawed at him, but he pushed them aside. He had come too far to let fear hold him back. The keypad beeped, and the door slid open with a hiss. The group slipped inside, finding themselves in a sterile hallway lined with reinforced glass doors. Behind each one were rooms filled with strange equipment, medical devices, monitors, and what looked like containment pods. "What is this place?" Anna murmured, her eyes darting from one room to the next. Ethan's gaze landed on a door at the end of the hall. It was marked with a simple plaque, Subject X-13. His chest tightened. This has to be it. Inside the room, the air was cold and sterile, the hum of machinery filling the space. At its center was a glass enclosure, and inside it was a figure, motionless, surrounded by an array of monitors and medical equipment. "Sophie?" Ethan breathed, his voice barely audible. He rushed forward, his hands pressing against the glass. The woman inside was thinner than he remembered, her face pale and gaunt, but there was no mistaking her. It was Sophie. Anna and Luca joined him, their expressions grim. "She's alive?" Anna said, her voice filled with equal parts relief and concern. "But barely." Ethan's hands curled into fists. "How do we get her out?" Luca examined the console next to the enclosure. "This system's locked down tight. It'll take time to override." "Then start," Ethan said, his voice sharp. "We're not leaving without her." As Luca worked, Anna kept watch at the door. The tension in the room was palpable, each second stretching into an eternity. Ethan's eyes never left Sophie, his heart breaking at the sight of her frailty. Finally, Luca let out a triumphant sigh. "Got it. The containment system is deactivating." The monitors flickered, and the glass enclosure hissed as it began to open. Ethan stepped forward, his hands trembling as he reached for Sophie. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, their gazes met. "Ethan?" she whispered, her voice weak but unmistakable. "I'm here," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've got you." Before he could say more, an alarm blared, the shrill sound cutting through the air like a knife. Anna cursed under her breath. "They know we're here. We need to move now." Ethan scooped Sophie into his arms, her body light and fragile. "I'm not leaving her." Luca grabbed the tablet and motioned toward the door. "This way. We'll take the secondary tunnel." The group moved quickly, the alarms growing louder as the complex came alive with activity. Guards shouted in the distance, their footsteps echoing through the halls. Every turn felt like a gamble, every step a race against time. They reached the tunnel entrance just as the first guards appeared behind them, their shouts punctuated by gunfire. Anna returned fire, her movements precise and calculated, while Luca helped Ethan and Sophie into the tunnel. As the group descended into the darkness, Ethan's grip on Sophie tightened. For the first time in 20 years, she was in his arms. But as the shouts and gunfire faded, replaced by the silence of the tunnel, one thought loomed in his mind. They weren't safe yet, and the secret Sophie carried might still cost them everything. The group emerged from the tunnel into the dense forest, the cold night air biting at their faces. Behind them, the faint echo of alarms and shouting guards grew fainter with every step. Ethan cradled Sophie in his arms, her fragile frame trembling against him. Her eyes fluttered open briefly, her gaze meeting his. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "You shouldn't have come." "I had to," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I couldn't leave you." Sophie's eyes closed again, exhaustion overtaking her. Ethan tightened his grip, his resolve hardening. They had escaped the facility, but the fight was far from over. Back at the safe house, Luca worked quickly to secure the perimeter while Anna prepared a makeshift bed for Sophie. Ethan laid her down gently, brushing a strand of hair from her face. For the first time in 2 decades, he felt a glimmer of peace. Yet it was overshadowed by the weight of unanswered questions. Anna pulled him aside, her face etched with concern. She's in bad shape. Whatever they did to her, it's taken a toll. Ethan nodded, his jaw clenched. Can you help her? I'll do what I can, Anna said. But she needs a hospital, and we can't risk taking her to one. We'll figure something out, Ethan said firmly. Just keep her stable. As Sophie rested, Luca decrypted more of the files from the USB drive. The small cabin was filled with the faint hum of his laptop and the rhythmic clicking of keys. Ethan sat beside him, watching as page after page of classified documents appeared on the screen. These files are insane, Luca said, shaking his head. They've been running operations like this for decades. Erasing people, creating new identities, infiltrating governments. But there's something bigger here. What do you mean? Ethan asked. Luca pointed to a folder labeled Phase Omega. Inside were blueprints, schematics, and notes detailing an experimental program. At its core was a single objective: total control through psychological reprogramming. They weren't just erasing people, Luca said. They were rewriting them, turning them into assets, spies, even weapons. Sophie must have uncovered this before they took her. Ethan's stomach churned. And they were doing this to her? Luca hesitated. It's possible, but it looks like she resisted. Most subjects are broken within weeks. Sophie lasted 20 years. That's unheard of. Ethan's hands curled into fists. The thought of Sophie enduring such torment, fighting alone for so long, filled him with equal parts rage and despair. Is there anything in there about how to stop them? Luca shook his head. Not yet. But if we can figure out who's at the top of this, maybe we can cut the head off the snake. Hours later, Sophie stirred, her weak voice calling out for Ethan. He rushed to her side, taking her hand in his. Her eyes opened, their once vivid green dulled but still filled with determination. Ethan, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. You have to stop them. We will, he said, his voice firm. But I need to know everything. Sophie's gaze flickered to Luca and Anna, then back to Ethan. They were building something. Program. Phase Omega. It wasn't just about control. It was about domination. They want to rewrite the world, one person at a time. Her words sent a chill down Ethan's spine. How do we stop it? There's a failsafe, Sophie said, her breaths labored. A server. Controls everything. If you destroy it, you cripple the program. Where is it? Ethan asked. Sophie closed her eyes, as if summoning the strength to continue. Berlin. An underground facility. The files, they'll have the exact location. Ethan turned to Luca. Find it. Luca nodded, his fingers flying over the keyboard. I'll pull the coordinates. But if it's underground, it'll be heavily fortified. Ethan looked back at Sophie, his hand tightening around hers. You've fought long enough. Let me finish this. The next morning, the group prepared for the mission. Luca pinpointed the facility's location, a subterranean bunker beneath an unassuming industrial park on the outskirts of Berlin. It was a fortress, but they had no choice. If they didn't act now, the chance to dismantle Ithaca's network might vanish forever. Sophie insisted on coming with them, her voice trembling but resolute. I know the system. You'll need me. Ethan hesitated but eventually relented, knowing she wouldn't take no for an answer. Anna packed medical supplies, while Luca loaded their vehicle with gear for the infiltration. As they set out, the weight of their mission hung heavy over them. The industrial park was deceptively quiet, its rows of warehouses blending into the gray, overcast sky. Ethan, Sophie, Anna, and Luca parked a safe distance away, using binoculars to survey the area. There's a main entrance, Luca said, but it's a death trap. We'll have to use the ventilation system to get inside. Anna nodded, her sharp eyes scanning the area. We'll go in pairs. Ethan and Sophie take the vent. Luca and I will provide cover and create a distraction if necessary. Ethan turned to Sophie. Are you ready? She nodded, her expression fierce despite her frailty. Let's finish this. The vent was narrow and claustrophobic, its metal walls cold against Ethan's hands as he crawled forward. Sophie followed close behind, her breathing labored but steady. They emerged into a maintenance corridor, their flashlights cutting through the dim light. Following Sophie's directions, they made their way to the control center. The corridor opened into a massive underground chamber, its walls lined with server racks humming softly in the cold, sterile air. At its center was a terminal bathed in an ominous red glow. This is it, Sophie said, her voice trembling. The core server. Ethan approached the terminal, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. How do we shut it down? Sophie leaned on him for support, her hands trembling as she entered a series of commands. We overload it. Force a system crash. As she worked, alarms blared, and the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the chamber. Anna's voice crackled over the comms. We've got company. Lots of it. Hurry, Ethan urged. Sophie's fingers moved faster, the commands flowing despite her obvious exhaustion. Almost there, she said. Just a few more seconds. The first wave of guards burst into the chamber, their weapons raised. Ethan stepped in front of Sophie, shielding her with his body. Stay behind me. Anna and Luca appeared in the doorway, their weapons blazing as they provided cover fire. Sophie entered the final command, and the room was flooded with a blinding white light. The hum of the servers grew into a deafening roar before falling silent. It's done, Sophie said, her voice barely audible. The system is down. Ethan grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the exit. Then let's get out of here. The group fought their way back through the facility, the guards in disarray as the core systems failed. Explosions rocked the structure, sending showers of sparks and debris raining down. By the time they emerged into the cold night air, the facility was engulfed in chaos. Exhausted but alive, they climbed into the vehicle and sped away, the sound of sirens fading into the distance. As they drove into the night, Ethan glanced at Sophie, her head resting against his shoulder. For the first time in years, the weight of uncertainty began to lift. They had dealt Ithaca a critical blow, but the fight wasn't over. Thank you, Sophie whispered, her voice filled with gratitude and exhaustion. Ethan kissed her forehead, his voice steady. We're just getting started. The group drove for hours, finally stopping in a remote clearing surrounded by dense forest. The faint glow of the destroyed facility was still visible on the horizon, but the group was far enough away to catch their breath. Exhaustion weighed heavily on all of them, but the knowledge of what they had accomplished brought a flicker of hope. Ethan sat beside Sophie, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders as she leaned against him. We did it, he said softly, though the weight in his voice made it clear he knew the battle wasn't over. Sophie smiled faintly, her face pale but determined. It's not the end, Ethan. They'll come for us. They'll try, Ethan said firmly, but we've taken out their heart. Without the servers, their operations are crippled. Luca and Anna joined them, both looking as weary as Ethan felt. Luca dropped a laptop onto the ground in front of them, its screen still glowing with encrypted files. We might have destroyed the servers, but I managed to pull this before everything went up in flames. Ethan raised an eyebrow. What's on it? Everything, Luca said, sitting cross-legged and gesturing at the screen. It's their entire operation, names, locations, funding sources. It's the roadmap to bringing them down completely. Anna's eyes narrowed. If we have this, why didn't they destroy it? It feels like too much of a win. Luca hesitated, his fingers tapping the edge of the laptop. I've been thinking about that. Maybe they didn't expect us to get this far. Or maybe this was a contingency, an insurance policy for them. Ethan leaned forward. Or a trap. As the group pored over the files, a new name emerged: Alexander Voss. He was listed as the founder and primary architect of Project Ithaca, a figure who had operated from the shadows for decades. Every critical decision, every covert operation, every disappearance, it all led back to him. "This is our target," Ethan said, his voice low but resolute. "If we take him down, we dismantle everything he's built." Sophie's hand trembled as she pointed to the screen. "He's not just their leader. He's the one who did this to me. He oversaw my reprogramming." Her voice broke, and Ethan immediately took her hand, his eyes blazing with fury. "Then he pays for what he's done." Anna nodded, her expression grim. "If we go after Voss, we need to be smart. He'll be surrounded by security, and he'll know we're coming." Luca pulled up another file, highlighting Voss's last known location. "He's operating out of a private estate in Zurich. It's fortified, but nothing compared to the facility we just took down." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Then that's where we go next." The journey to Zurich was tense, each mile bringing them closer to a confrontation they all knew could be their last. Sophie spent most of the trip in quiet reflection, her energy drained but her resolve unshaken. Ethan sat beside her, his mind racing through the details of their plan. When they arrived in Zurich, the estate loomed over a secluded stretch of countryside, its sprawling grounds protected by high walls and surveillance towers. The group parked a safe distance away, using binoculars to study the layout. "Guards at every entrance," Anna observed. "And those towers are definitely armed." "We'll need a diversion," Luca said. "Something to draw their attention away from the main house." Ethan nodded. "Luca and Anna, you create the distraction. Sophie and I will go for Voss." Sophie hesitated, her gaze flickering between Ethan and the estate. "Ethan, if we get him, you can't hesitate. No matter what he says, no matter what he tries." Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder. "We'll do whatever it takes to end this. Together." As night fell, the plan went into motion. Luca and Anna set off a series of small explosions along the perimeter, drawing guards away from the main house. Ethan and Sophie used the chaos to slip through a side entrance, moving quickly and silently through the sprawling estate. Inside, the house was eerily quiet, its opulent halls filled with shadows. They navigated the maze of corridors, following the map Luca had decrypted from the files. At last, they reached a heavily secured office on the upper floor. Ethan planted a small charge on the lock, and with a muffled blast, the door swung open. Inside, Alexander Voss stood waiting, a calm smile on his face. He was older than Ethan had expected, his silver hair neatly combed, his tailored suit immaculate. But his eyes were sharp, calculating. "Mr. Carter," Voss said smoothly. "And Sophie, it's a pleasure to finally meet you both." Ethan stepped forward, his fists clenched. "You won't be smiling for long." Voss chuckled softly, his tone condescending. "Do you really think you've won? You've destroyed one facility, crippled one operation. But Ithaca is far bigger than you can imagine. It's not just me, it's an idea. And you can't kill an idea." Sophie's voice cut through the tension, sharp and cold. "You turned me into a weapon. You destroyed my life. And now you're going to pay for it." Voss's expression faltered, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. "Sophie, you don't understand. I was trying to save you. Ithaca's work, our work, it's about evolution, not destruction. You were—" "Stop," Sophie said, her voice trembling. "You don't get to justify this. Not anymore." Ethan stepped closer, his voice low and dangerous. "This ends tonight. Where are the rest of your operations?" Voss smirked, leaning back against his desk. "Even if I told you, it wouldn't matter. Others will take my place. You've started a war you can't win." Ethan raised his weapon, but before he could act, Sophie placed a hand on his arm. "Let me," she said softly. Sophie stepped forward, her gaze locking onto Voss's. "For 20 years you tried to break me, but you failed. And now, I'm going to dismantle everything you've built." Before Voss could respond, Sophie pressed a button on the tablet Luca had given her. A signal burst through the estate's network, scrambling its communications and sending the final piece of data to whistleblowers around the globe. "It's over," she said, her voice steady. "You've lost." Vasa's calm facade shattered. "You don't know what you've done," he snarled. "You've doomed us all." As alarms blared throughout the estate, Ethan and Sophie turned to leave. Anna and Luca's voices crackled over the comms, urging them to move quickly. Guards stormed the upper floors, but the group fought their way out, escaping into the night. By the time they regrouped in a safe house on the outskirts of Zurich, the first news reports were breaking. Ithaca's operations, exposed in meticulous detail, were making headlines worldwide. Governments and organizations scrambled to distance themselves, and protests erupted as the truth spread. Ethan sat beside Sophie, his hand wrapped around hers. "It's done." She leaned against him, her voice soft. "It's not over, Ethan, but it's a start." For the first time in years, they allowed themselves to hope. The fight wasn't finished, but they had struck a blow that would echo for generations. And as they watched the world begin to change, they knew they would face whatever came next, together. The following days were a blur of headlines, breaking news, and global uproar. The fallout from the exposed Ithaca files rippled across continents, toppling corporate empires, implicating government officials, and sending shockwaves through intelligence communities. The shadow network that had thrived in secrecy for decades was crumbling under the weight of its own secrets. Ethan, Sophie, Anna, and Luca watched from their safe house in Zurich, their faces illuminated by the glow of a laptop streaming live coverage. Every revelation brought a mix of satisfaction and unease. They had struck a devastating blow, but they knew Ithaca's remnants would retaliate. One evening, as the group debriefed over scattered documents and hastily prepared meals, Anna broke the silence. "We've done what no one else could, exposed them, but we also painted targets on our backs. Ithaca may be weakened, but they're not dead." Luca nodded, his fingers drumming on the table. "I've been monitoring chatter on encrypted networks. Their operatives are regrouping, trying to salvage what's left. They're wounded, but they're still dangerous." Ethan leaned back in his chair, his eyes flickering to Sophie, who sat quietly, her gaze distant. "We knew this wouldn't be the end," he said. "But now the world knows. We've shifted the balance." Sophie's voice was soft but resolute. "Knowing isn't enough. They'll adapt, rebuild. If we don't keep fighting, they'll rise again." Ethan reached for her hand, his touch grounding her. "Then we keep fighting." The group began planning their next moves, poring over the remaining Ithaca files Luca had decrypted. The data pointed to splinter cells scattered across the globe, each operating independently but linked by a shared goal: survival and resurgence. Among the most critical leads was a name, the Paragon Initiative, a covert program designed to rebuild Ithaca's influence under a new guise. "They're already planning their comeback," Anna said, her tone grim. "If we don't shut this down, we're back where we started." Luca pulled up a map, highlighting locations tied to the initiative. The files mention a summit in Istanbul. Key players from Ithaca's remnants are meeting there in a week. "If we can intercept them," Ethan nodded. "Then we cut the head off the snake before it grows back." As the group prepared for Istanbul, Sophie took Ethan aside. Her eyes were brighter now, though shadows of her past lingered. "I need you to promise me something," she said. "Anything," Ethan replied. "If we get separated, if something happens to me, don't stop. Don't let this end with me." Ethan's heart ached, but he nodded. "Nothing's going to happen to you. We're in this together." Sophie smiled faintly, her hand brushing against his cheek. Always. The mission in Istanbul was their boldest yet. Disguised as delegates at the summit, the group infiltrated a luxury hotel overlooking the Bosporus, where Ithaca's remnants had gathered. The air was thick with tension as they navigated the opulent halls, their identities carefully forged to evade detection. Ethan and Sophie posed as financiers, mingling with the crowd to gather intel. Anna and Luca, stationed in a nearby suite, monitored the event's security systems, feeding information through earpieces. As the night wore on, Ethan's gaze landed on a figure at the heart of the room, a woman with striking silver hair and a commanding presence. Her name was Margot Bellamy, a former intelligence officer turned Ithaca strategist. She was one of the architects of the Paragon Initiative. "That's her," Ethan murmured into his mic. "Bellamy." Sophie's grip on his arm tightened. "She's dangerous. We need to be careful." Ethan nodded. "Luca, Anna. What's her angle here?" Luca's voice crackled through the earpiece. "She's hosting a closed-door meeting in 10 minutes. Room 408. If you're going to make a move, that's your window." Ethan and Sophie made their way to the meeting room, using their forged credentials to slip past security. Inside, Bellamy and a handful of operatives were deep in discussion, their voices low and tense. Plans for the Paragon Initiative were spread across the table, blueprints, funding charts, and encrypted communications. As Ethan and Sophie listened, Bellamy's voice cut through the noise. "Ithaca isn't dead. We've survived worse. The world may think they've won, but this is just the beginning. Paragon will rise, and when it does, no one will stop us." Ethan exchanged a glance with Sophie. This was their moment. The takedown was swift and brutal. Ethan and Sophie stormed the room, weapons drawn, as Anna and Luca disabled the building's security feeds. The operatives resisted, but the group's coordination and determination overpowered them. Bellamy was restrained, her cold composure cracking for the first time. "You think this changes anything?" she spat, glaring at Ethan. "You're playing a game you can't win." Ethan leaned in, his voice low and steady. "We already have." With Bellamy captured and the Paragon Initiative's plan seized, the group left Istanbul in secrecy, ensuring their identities remained hidden. The mission was a success, but the victory felt bittersweet. Each step forward came with new risks, new sacrifices. Back at their safe house, Sophie stood by the window watching the sunrise. Ethan joined her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "What's next?" she asked softly. Ethan gazed at the horizon, his expression resolute. "We keep going, until every last piece of Ithaca is gone." Sophie nodded, leaning into him. "Then we finish this." As the first light of day broke over the city, Ethan, Sophie, Anna, and Luca prepared for the battles ahead. They were no longer just survivors. They were a force, determined to dismantle the shadows that had shaped their lives. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, they felt something they hadn't in years: hope.